Our images up there. Hi, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. So my name is Professor Mitchell Ornstein, and I'm chair of Russian and East European Studies here at University of Pennsylvania. We're really pleased to welcome the fantastic author of the book Red Star, Yellow Star here today, Professor Jelena Subotic, who is a professor of political science at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Somebody I've known for quite a number of years. It seems like since the times when she was a master's student at Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and we're just super happy to have her here today to talk about Holocaust memory in Europe. With the war going on in Russia and Ukraine, I think everybody's become extremely aware how history matters and how historical memory really shapes the response of nations to all sorts of different things. And Professor Subotic's book does an excellent job. You'll hear the presentation. I won't go too long into it, but of really showing the ways that the Holocaust has been imagined and reimagined in former communist states in a way to shift blame away from national movements that may have collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War, and gives a very in detail look at Lithuania, at Serbia, Croatia, in that regard. I found it a really compelling book when I read it. It's about a year ago now, and we're extremely happy to welcome Professor Subotic to University of Pennsylvania and for our streaming audience as well. So without further ado, I hand the floor over to Professor Subotic, who will give her presentation, and we will have plenty of opportunity for questions at the end. So write down your questions, be prepared to put your questions in the chat, because we will certainly also be willing to answer those questions that come through via Facebook Live. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a real joy to be here. I have a slideshow that I would like to. Yep. So in 2014, I visited my hometown of Belgrade, Serbia, and I went to see an exhibition at the Serbian Historical Museum. And the exhibition was called "In the Name of the People, Political Repression in Serbia After World War II." And the exhibition promised to display new historical documents and evidence of various crimes, such as assassinations, kidnappings, detentions in camps of the Yugoslav communist regime after 1945. As I walked through the exhibit, I stopped in my tracks. I recognized the photograph. In the Belgrade exhibition, this image was displayed in the section devoted to the communist-era camp for political prisoners on the Adriatic island of Goli Otok in today's Croatia. The exhibition describes the photograph as, quote, "the example of living conditions of Goli Otok prisoners." But I knew that a photograph was not it. In front of me was a well-known photograph of prisoners from the Nazi Buchenwald concentration camp, including Elie Wiesel, who is in the middle row over there. And this picture was taken at Buchenwald Liberation in April 1945. It is one of the most well-known photographs of the Holocaust. So I went home, called a couple of historian friends, who assured me that complaints had already been lodged with the museum and that the display was about to be corrected. Sometime thereafter, in response to an outcry from Holocaust historians, a small note was taped underneath the display caption that read, quote, "a photograph of prisoner boxed beds in Dachau camp," end quote. Now, that nobody bothered to check that a photograph was, in fact, from Buchenwald and not from Dachau is symptomatic of the broad irrelevance with which the Holocaust is met in Serbia. But what I took from this exhibition was not only the indifference and carelessness when dealing with the Holocaust, but more fundamentally, the attempt to equate communism and fascism, and in doing so, appropriate Holocaust remembrance and imagery to delegitimize communism. But this is hardly an indigenous Serbian invention. In Hungary, here's the House of Terror, which goes out of its way to bring home the message that fascism and communism were flip sides of the same coin. There are multiple visual representations of Black totalitarianism and red totalitarianism, of the Black arrow cross and the red star, of the fascist uniform and the communist uniform. And in addition to equating fascism and communism, and doing so with blunt force, many of these museums and memorials have also begun depicting their entire nation states as victims of foreign regimes, thus completely ignoring both the actual lived experience of various victims of these regimes, but also, and more importantly for my purposes here, completely erasing any discussion of local complicity for any historical crimes, be they crimes of the Holocaust or crimes of the Gulag. For example, the House of Terror Museum in Budapest narrates the story of Hungary's 20th century experience as a nation victim of the foreign communist regime. In the museum's exposition, the fascist era begins with a German occupation in 1944, and not in 1940, when Hungary joined the Axis alliance. This shift, therefore, completely removes the history of the Holocaust in Hungary before 1944, the period that left 60,000 Hungarian Jews killed as early as 1942. The extermination carried out not by Germans, but by Hungarian forces under the rule of Regent Miklos Horthy. Similarly, the memorial to the victims of the German occupation, erected in 2014 in Budapest, memorializes Hungary, the country, as the main victim of the German occupation, by a not very subtle depiction of Germany's imperial ego crushing of Hungary, which is symbolized by Archangel Gabriel. But note the deep domestic contestation this memorial has produced. At the bottom of the picture, you can see handwritten notes and photographs left by Holocaust survivors or their family members that want to tell the story of 430,000 Jews who were deported from Hungary, mostly to Auschwitz, the quickest rate of deportation in the history of the Holocaust, taking less than 2 months, and done with the active participation of Hungarian civil servants. And in Vilnius, Lithuania, the top tourist destination in the city is the Museum of Victims of Genocide. But in a country that was ground zero for the Holocaust, where 95% of the pre-war Jewish population was annihilated, the highest number of any occupied country anywhere in Europe, this is not the museum to those victims of that genocide. It is instead a museum to the victims of the Soviet occupation that in Lithuania is considered the real genocide. And yet, this remembrance of the 20th century then is not exactly Holocaust denial. Viktor Orban even declared 2014 a year of Holocaust commemoration. However problematic, it does not predominantly feature voices that deny the Holocaust as a historical fact, nor challenge its most established realities. It is also not quite the same as trivialization. While the emphasis always is on the larger ethnic groups, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Lithuanians suffering, it is relatively rare to hear outright belittling of Jewish victimization. A more nuanced way of understanding this type of Holocaust remembrance, I suggest, is as memory appropriation, where the memory of the Holocaust is used to memorialize a different kind of suffering, such as suffering under communism or suffering from ethnic violence perpetrated by other groups. It is Holocaust remembrance turned inward and away from the actual victims of the Holocaust or the Holocaust itself, and into what the Polish writer Ewa Plonowska-Zjarek calls the narcissistic identification with Jewish suffering. But why does all this matter? After all, Holocaust revisionism is not new, and it is not particularly surprising, and has certainly led to much revisionism in the West as much as it has in the East. And here's what I respond. My principal argument is that post-communist states today are dealing with conflicting sources of insecurity. They are anxious to be perceived as fully European by quote-unquote core Western European states, a status that remains fleeting. Being fully European, however, means sharing in the cosmopolitan European narratives of the 20th century, perhaps the strongest being the narrative of the Holocaust. But this was not always the case. What we today refer to as the Holocaust did not exist as a concept or as a marker in global collective memory prior to the early 1960s. Holocaust memory has developed over time and has gone through various phases in various countries and over various periods. In the West, what we today would recognize as the narrative of the Holocaust emerged with a series of important trials in the 1960s, mostly of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem and the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, as well as a series of popular cultural events, such as the American TV show The Holocaust in the late 1970s, and especially the Schindler's List in 1993, all of which placed Jewish suffering at the center of the Holocaust narrative and presented a visual and symbolic repertoire of how we think the Holocaust looked like, which remained mostly stable until today. But the Soviet-dominated East placed events of World War II within a larger narrative of communist revolutionary triumph and anti-fascist heroism. Communist memory was hegemonic memory, not open to alternative or particular claims on suffering, such as the suffering of the Jews. In communist Eastern Europe, Holocaust remembrance was exclusively produced through the framework of anti-fascism, because this link established the communist regime with its new post-war identity and provided it with ongoing political legitimacy. The two ways of remembering East and West therefore diverged almost immediately after the war and developed in quite different directions throughout the post-war period. And it is at the point of contact after the end of communism in 1991 that these two ways of remembering began to cross paths. Almost immediately, the European narrative of the Holocaust created stress and resentment in post-communist states, which have been asked to accept and contribute to this primarily Western European account as members or candidate states of the European Union and NATO. The problem is that the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory as developed in the West did not narratively fit with a very different set of Holocaust memories in post-communist Europe. This lack of fit is evident primarily in the lack of centrality of the Shoah as the defining memory of the 20th century experience across the post-communist space. As Tony Judd put it, quote, "The really uncomfortable truth about World War II was that what happened to the Jews between 1939 and 1945 was not nearly as important to most of the protagonists as later sensibilities might wish," end quote. Instead of the memory of the Holocaust, Eastern European states after communism constructed their national identities on the memory of Stalinism and Soviet occupation, as well as pre-communist ethnic conflict with other states. The European centrality of the Holocaust then replaced the centrality of communist and ethnic victimization as the dominant organizing narrative of post-communist states, and was therefore threatening and destabilizing to these state identities. And so in this book, I document how, influencing European Union's own memory politics and legislation in the process, post-communist states have attempted to resolve these insecurities by putting forward a new kind of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust become appropriated to represent crimes of communism instead. The criminal past is not fully denied, but the responsibility for it is misdirected. And this accomplishes two things. It absolves the nation from acknowledging the responsibility for its criminal past, while at the same time it makes communism as a political project criminal. But I want to make two additional important points. The centrality of the Holocaust as a foundational European narrative is also soundly rejected across post-communist Europe because of its perceived elevation of Jewish victimhood above victimhood of other regional majority ethnic groups, a move that is increasingly openly resented. In the absence of almost any Jews across vast swaths of the East, post-communist national identities were built first on a rejection of the communist pan-national identity project, where the organizing narrative is loyalty to the socialist and not the ethnic subject, and instead on ethnic majoritarian and therefore very homogeneous basis that leaves almost no room for incorporation of minority narratives. Holocaust remembrance therefore challenges the security of a nation's identity because it problematizes the very biography on which this identity was constructed. Further, the European Holocaust memory's focus on Jewish suffering is also rejected in much of post-communist Europe because it brings about discussion about extensive and deep local complicity in the Holocaust and material and political benefits of the complete Jewish absence across Eastern Europe. Jewish businesses, homes, and property have over decades of looting, followed by communist seizures, slowly morphed into the general economy with difficult and sporadic attempts at restitution. The fact that post-World War II Jewish communities in these countries are negligible in numbers and have limited political clout is not incidental to this narrative. Once multicultural societies with large Jewish minorities are now mostly ethnically homogeneous. This very fact of post-war ethnic homogeneity is a problem anthropologist Michael Herzfeld calls cultural intimacy, an issue of domestic identity building, the thing that builds the nation together, but simultaneously an issue of international embarrassment and sometimes even shame. And this is why much of Eastern Europe is a purposeful site of non-memory, a site of dismembered multi-ethnicity, a landscape of erasure. So next, I want to demonstrate that a way out of this condition of ontological insecurity, which is insecurity about its own identity, for post-communist states, was to connect the undesirable remembrance of the Holocaust with the desirable remembrance of communism and its crimes. The consequence of this move was a new inverted memory of the Holocaust, where the crimes of fascism came to be represented as crimes of communism. Now, post-communist European states first encountered the European push for a unified cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust as they tried to join various European organizations after 1991, foremost in their applications for EU membership, but also membership in other European institutions, such as, for example, the Council of Europe. A major European international push, however, was the Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust in January 2000, convened by Sweden to define a common framework for European Holocaust remembrance, research, and education. The forum established the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, since renamed International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which remains the most explicit international organization that constructs, institutionalizes, and diffuses transnational Holocaust memory in Europe. In 2005, the European Parliament adopted its most complete resolution on the Holocaust, which established 27th January, the day of liberation of Auschwitz in 1945 by the Soviet Red Army, as the European Holocaust Memorial Day across the whole of the EU. And while post-communist states accepted this new regulation, signed documents, and adopted major parameters of the memory framework, not wanting to jeopardize the delicate process of EU accession, once they were safely in the EU, the new Europeans demanded a thorough renegotiation of European memory politics, one that denies the Holocaust its centrality for post-war European memory, and instead places it on par with the other major totalitarianism of the 20th century, communism. Specifically, East European states forged alliances with the Western European right, most directly the European People's Party in the European Parliament, in pushing for EU resolutions and proclamations that would decentralize the Holocaust from pan-European memory and add crimes of Stalinism as its equal. The push to commemorate side by side the two 20th century totalitarianisms culminated in two European Union documents. The 2008 Declaration on the Proclamation of 23rd of August as the European Day of Remembrance for Victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and Resolution on European Conscience and Totalitarianism, which built on the 2008 Prague Declaration of the same name. And this Prague Declaration is perhaps the most explicit document that lays out the ideological framework post-communist European states have used regarding the place of the Holocaust and communist memory. Well, the Declaration's first article states that, quote, both the Nazi and the communist totalitarian regimes should each be judged by their own terrible merits, end quote. The Declaration then goes on to make this claim, quote, exterminating and deporting whole nations and groups of population were indivisible parts of the ideologies they availed themselves with, end quote, which explicitly equated the specifically genocidal aspect of Nazism, extermination of whole nations, and attributed it to communism. And this rhetorical move of referring to communist crimes instead of Stalinist crimes is critical here, as it implies that terror was communism's central organizing feature, which then makes it easily narratively equated with fascism. Indeed, this equation of the two regimes as being structurally the same even led one European member of parliament to declare, quote, I ask the European Parliament to stand in solidarity with the victims of fascist communism, end quote. And please also note that the official banner of the Prague Declaration movement wants to prohibit the hammer and the sickle, not the swastika. I now want to further illustrate these arguments with some quick examples of contemporary Holocaust remembrance practices in Croatia, the newest EU member, and point to specific ways in which state power was used to discipline and organize political memory. Croatia's memory of the Holocaust is a source of severe state anxiety. Croatia's relationship with the Holocaust is deep, broad, and incredibly contentious. During World War II, Croatia declared an independent state, a Nazi puppet statelet governed by the homegrown fascist movement, the Ustasha. The Ustasha implemented fascist racial laws in large part autonomously and sometimes even more brutally than the German Reich. Anti-Jewish laws, Aryanization of Jewish property, followed by the deportation and extermination of Croatia's Jews, were carried out with great speed and efficiency, earning much praise from Berlin. Significantly, however, the Ustasha were not interested only in the annihilation of Croatian Jews. The central part of their project was also the full-scale destruction of Croatia's large Serb and smaller Roma minorities. Across a vast network of Croatian concentration and extermination camps, the largest of which was Jasenovac, which I'll talk about more in a minute, as well as through summary executions across the country and deportations to other Nazi camps. Some 32,000 or 80% of Croatian Jews, some 300,000 or 17% of Croatian Serbs, and almost all Croatian Roma, some 25,000, were killed between 1941 and 1945. This unusable past presented a serious problem for the new Croatia, which emerged an independent state out of the rubble of the former Yugoslavia in 1991. In constructing its post-Yugoslav identity, the new Croatia needed to sidestep the communist past as a legitimate period of the country's history and institute a clear historical connection with a pre-communist state as an inspirational model for contemporary manifestation of ethnic statehood, thus stabilizing Croatia's state identity through time. The problem, however, was that the only modern independent Croatia the new state could go back to and root this new statehood in was the World War II fascist Croatian state. and all the memory baggage it brought with it. And so, as part of this memory replacement, Croatia embarked on a hurricane of World War II monument destruction in an attempt to visually erase any connection Croatia had with the 50 years of communism and 50 years of Yugoslavia. Almost all communist-era monuments to World War II, including the few monuments that mention specifically Jewish victims, were fully removed or partially destroyed, vandalized, or desecrated. Often victim groups would put up a replica of the monument only to see it disappear again, often within 24 hours. Some monuments were simply replaced. In place of a monument to anti-fascist struggle, a new monument to Croatia's War of Independence from 1991 to 1995 would spring up in its place. Out of 6,000 monuments memorializing World War II in Croatia, almost 3,000 monuments, including more than 700 monuments of exquisite artistic or cultural value, were blown up with explosives, destroyed fully or in part in the post-independence decade between 1991 and 2000. Not only was no one prosecuted for destruction of cultural property, but in many locations, it was the local chapter of the Croatian ruling political party, Croatian Democratic Union, that organized the removal of the monuments. From the narrative perspective of the new Croatian state, the monuments to World War II had to be destroyed because they represented a symbol of a different future, a vision of an international and domestic order Croatia no longer wanted and found threatening to its new national identity. And while the public memory of the Holocaust and genocide committed in the independent state of Croatia was completely absent from the constitutive identity of the new state, a new public memory emerged that has since overtaken all other remembrance of World War II and began to be referred to as the Croatian Holocaust. This was the constructed memory of the massacre of Croatian soldiers, most of them retreating Ustasha, who refused to surrender at the end of the war, but also many members of their families who had been killed by the Yugoslav communist partisans at the end of the war in May 1945 on the territories of what is today Austria and Slovenia. The events of May 1945, which are called Bleiburg in Croatia because the commemorations occur annually at Bleiburg, Austria, even though the actual killing took place in different locations, since 1991, for the purposes of Croatia's new state identity building, began to be seen and commemorated as a communist assault on the entire Croatian nation. From the realm of unofficial diaspora commemorations, the Bleiburg ceremonies in post-Yugoslav Croatia became fully state-sanctioned, and the Croatian government designated the Day of Bleiburg commemoration every May as a day of memory of Croatian victims in the struggle for freedom and independence everywhere. This right here was the state power to redirect political memory. But this new remembrance was not a remembrance of just a massacre. It became a memory of the Holocaust, but with Croats as victims and not as perpetrators. An early explicit use of the term the Holocaust for Bleiburg occurred at the 20th anniversary of the events in 1995, when the Speaker of the Croatian Parliament addressed the Assembly and called Bleiburg the Holocaust of Croatian martyrs. The appropriation of the Holocaust for Bleiburg specifically, and then for the larger Croatian historical suffering, has since become ubiquitous. The claim that Bleiburg was the Holocaust of Croatian Catholics has fully entered the Croatian public narrative and goes mostly unchallenged in the public sphere. The commemorations at Bleiburg, however, did not occur in an international vacuum. In fact, much of Croatia's contemporary memorialization follows the narrative framework offered in the 2008 EU Prague Declaration that I talked about. The declaration's statement on two totalitarianisms is referred to whenever a discussion arises about proper remembrance of Croatia's fascist legacies. At the 2011 Bleiburg commemoration, Andrija Hebrang, then member of the Croatian parliament, said, quote, "Bleiburg is the biggest symbol of Croatian suffering that equates fascism and communism. Communism becomes worse than fascism. It becomes the world's biggest evil because it turns into the system of killing everyone who thought differently, end quote. And it is also not incidental that commemorations at Bleiburg have since become fully fledged neo-Nazi and neo-fascist gatherings, where old black uniforms and black flags of World War II fascist Croatian militia are proudly displayed to increasing discomfort of Austria, on which territory this event takes place and which may have some of its own insecurities regarding Holocaust memory. But it is Jasenovac, the central location of the Holocaust in Croatia, the site where 85,000 Serbs, Jews, and Roma were killed in unspeakably gruesome ways, that continues to be the most significant and contested site of Holocaust remembrance in Croatia. There are almost no historical photographs of Jasenovac, as the Ustasha by the end of the war blew it up and destroyed all records as the communist partisans were advancing. This photograph of a Jewish man forced to remove his ring right before being shot is a rare surviving photograph. Today, there are no physical remains of the camp. Instead, there is a towering and beautiful flower memorial built in the 1960s during communist Yugoslavia. However, a new narrative has emerged in the past few years that claims that the story of Jasenovac was overblown and that its high death toll was fabricated by Yugoslav communist and later Serbian nationalist propaganda. This narrative has then further morphed into the claim that Jasenovac was in fact not a fascist camp at all, but it was run by communists as a place of mass execution of Croatian patriots after the end of World War II. This narrative is promoted by established as well as revisionist historians, including a brand new research institute, which purpose is to determine the truth about the communist camp. A high-profile recent revisionist push was the film Jasenovac: The Truth, which received the official award by the city of Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. The film purports to show evidence that Jasenovac was in fact run by communists. The evidence for these claims is almost comical in its amateurish forgery. They're fake newspaper headlines, images of bodies turning up on the banks of the river, which is located upstream from the camp, photographs of apparently happy and content Serb and Jewish inmates, as if to show that nothing bad happened there during the war, which turned out to be photographs of a football team from 1978, and so on and so on. But no matter, this revisionism has become so mainstream and state-sponsored that in 2018, Croatian president called for the creation of an international commission to determine the truth about the camp between 1941 and 45, but also after, the president said, indicating that the narrative that Jasenovac was a communist camp after the war was now accepted at the top seat of power. Similarly, in the attempt to erase fascist crimes and use their imagery to represent real or imagined crimes of communism, at the site of the Stara Gradiška camp, which was part of the Jasenovac complex of camps, the Croatian government mounted a memorial plaque in 2011 memorializing political prisoners, victims of the communist regime, who perished in the Stara Gradiška prison on the occasion of August 23rd, Day of Commemoration of Victims of Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes. And note the direct use of the EU resolution establishing August 23rd as a day of commemoration of victims of two totalitarianisms. And the use of the word prison and not camp is important because it directs remembrance to the pre-war and post-war period when this site was indeed used as a regular criminal prison, but not to World War II era Ustasha death camp, where more than 12,000 Serbs, Jews, Roma, and other enemies of the independent state of Croatia, including a very high number of women and children, were killed. Out of 3 memorial plaques placed at the site of Stara Gradiška, not a single one indicates that it was the major concentration camp during World War II, where I should add in full disclosure, my father was interned as a child. 200 meters away, however, there is an old monument to victims of fascism between 1941 and 1945 that has since crumbled and is in ruins, nobody bothering to repair it. All of this revisionism has happened not in spite, but as a result of EU's own practices of remembrance, especially its reductionist interpretation of the 20th century as an era of two totalitarianisms, equal in their criminal nature. EU's youngest member, Croatia, was nothing but a quick study. So let me conclude. Why the Holocaust? Why now? The memory of the Holocaust has been debated and revisited and debated again. So why does all this still matter? My principal point that I want to leave you with is that while the historical and moral importance of Holocaust remembrance should be self-evident, Holocaust remembrance is also important for global politics. As my research documents, the move toward Holocaust appropriation across post-communist Europe indicates that there is a lot going on under the European Union cloak. As the alarming turns to liberalism in Poland and Hungary show, joining the EU was not the end of history, its architects imagined. And in fact, EU accession has allowed these states to embark on radical projects of historical inversion, which do tremendous violence to the historical record of World War II for very contemporary political purposes. So for example, this is a cartoon that was published in a right-wing Polish magazine in 2018, which shows a prevalent narrative in these circles that it was the Nazis and the communists that worked together to kill innocent Poles who were the main victims of what they call the Holocaust. Now, the question that motivated my research is simply, how did we get here? What explains the need of so many post-communist East European states to revisit the Holocaust now, 75 years later, and control the way in which the Holocaust is remembered, understood, and interpreted? The argument I made today is that these developments could best be understood as actions of profoundly ontologically insecure states. While scholars have analyzed domestic political machinations of various political structures, right-wing and or populist parties in particular, and ways in which they have instrumentalized Holocaust remembrance to make very specific domestic political gains, such as, for example, expanding the voter base, delegitimizing liberal opponents, or mobilizing nationalism, I have taken a broader view. I explored how states use their power, especially their mnemonic power, power over political memory, when their sense of self, their identity, was threatened by external political narratives that undermine the very basis of that identity. And as I have briefly shown, as they pursued their post-communist new European identities, these states encountered a solidified and codified political memory of the Holocaust, memory which did not fit with their own understanding of World War II. The desire to become European, to finally rejoin the West, then produced a particular type of Holocaust remembrance, which nominally followed the Western canon. Memorial days were instituted, museums were opened, memorials were built, textbooks were adapted, but in doing so used the existing narrative and visual imagery of the Holocaust to fight the real mnemonic battle of delegitimizing and criminalizing communism. I hope to demonstrate ways in which post-communist states constructed a narrative about the past that bolsters their identity and self-esteem in the present. Practices of Holocaust remembrance I described are important for contemporary politics because they indicate that the basis of nation building after communism was ethnic and exclusionary. While this new identity construction may not be about the Jews or about the Holocaust at all, it comes from the place of exclusion of others, the non-existent Jews, but also the existent new others, refugees, migrants, or other ethnic minorities, such as the Roma or Muslims. But most significantly and most globally, the great delegitimation of communism that has swept Europe since 1991 has also produced a de-delegitimation of fascism, which is repackaged, retold, and reinterpreted to look more palatable and polite in the 21st century. The great tragedy of the anti-communist movement is that it has weakened and made less imperative our collective anti-fascist movement, and we're now living the consequences. The Shoah, therefore, is not only East European past, it also continues to be its present. Thank you very much. And with that, I look forward to the questions.
Yes, so I think that we can
I think I have to close this. or
identify
minimize.
we can identify some questions coming in from online as well. And I think we do have some here, yeah? Can you, would you like me to read them?
Sure.
So one says, thank you for the lecture. Do you think that banning the hammer and sickle, but not the swastika, is due to the swastika's long non-Nazi history? So that's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question. I don't think that is as sophisticated as the understanding of where the visual history of the swastika comes in. I think it's a real push to equate communism with fascism. And I mean, you know, throughout this period, for example, there were popular movements, I know in Poland, but also in many other countries, with people wearing T-shirts that, you know, would cross the hammer and the sickle. And the whole point was to show that that should be an illegal icon, and it should be just as stigmatized, and it should be just as inappropriate for people to display it, even, you know, ironically on their shirts, as we have come to expect of the swastika. And the purpose of the Prague resolution, they just didn't really concern themselves with the problems that swastika brings, because their argument is that we all know about the crimes of fascism. Enough with all that. We've covered that. We know that the swastika is bad, but nobody knows how bad the hammer and the sickle is. And there were, you know, popular movements, youth movements, you know, of people showing, you know, putting on their little Facebook profiles, crossing the hammer and a sickle as a sign of your identity as somebody who's anti-communist and somebody who understands that communism was equally dangerous and totalitarian in nature. But the projection of all of that was towards the West. So we know this, but you in the West don't, and you think it's funny to put on a hammer and a sickle and like reverse Cyrillic letters on your T-shirt, like you're wearing Che Guevara T-shirt, and you don't know what you're talking about. And we're here to show you that when you do that, it's like you're wearing a swastika. So that was the political background of that.
Really enjoyed the lecture, thank you. So I had a few questions. One is just totally informational. Like I'm more or less familiar with the situation with regard to the submersion or repression of Holocaust memory in the state socialist and Moscow-aligned states of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, but not so much with what was going on with regard to Holocaust remembrance in Yugoslavia. So interested just to hear about whether there was actually a distinction in the way the Holocaust was the to participate in the Western European Holocaust moment in a different way than the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries did. So that was one question. I just don't know anything about it. And then two other just questions about the dynamics of the sort of Eastern European Holocaust revisionism and what has driven it and what has contributed to it. So one, I was interested in your take on the degree to which the peculiarities of post-Soviet Eastern European Holocaust remembrance are genealogically related to peculiarities of emigre memory cultures. All of, for instance, the Museum of the Occupation in Latvia was founded by American re-emigres from the Latvian exile culture. There are a great many emigres who fled because of their participation in, Nazi collaboration or just whatever Wehrmacht collaboration with the Red Army's advance across Eastern Europe, and wound up in America and in other places who created a whole memory culture in the West that was supported by Western anti-communist institutionalization of anti-communist politics, which supported the suppression of stories of collaboration in favor of stories of heroic resistance to communism. So I'm wondering how much you would like trace the state of post-Soviet memory culture with regard to Holocaust to the Cold War state of memory culture among emigre and diasporic Eastern European communities in the United States, largely. But then another question is about, you talked about anti-communism being at the center of the sort of dynamics, which I agree is one of the sort of main planks in terms of why you want to weaponize memory culture with regard to the theory of the twin totalitarianisms in Eastern Europe. It's extraordinary useful cudgel with which to beat up socialists and even liberals, right? So it's this right convergence by making all communists into Stalinists, into Stalinist fascists. But there's also a memory world in lots of places, especially at the borders with the Russian Federation.
Yes.
And I'm interested in your take on the weaponization of this version of memory as an anti-Russian tool. And also in the sort of general dynamic of the Russian response to weaponization of critique of the Nazification of Eastern European memory culture, which we see obviously going on right now. The whole denazification of Ukraine is based on a critique, which in some ways is in harmony with yours, except it's this grotesque and absurd, exaggerated version of it. So I'm wondering if you can give an account of the sort of dynamic of extreme positions in the area that is driven by the memory war across the Russian Federation Europe border, as well as one of the dynamics that contributes to the peculiarities of the memory culture of the Holocaust.
Well, all great questions. I'm very happy to talk about all these topics. So the first, the uniqueness of Yugoslavia, or at least the difference. So one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, one of the motivating factors, is that Yugoslavia sits at the periphery of Holocaust historiography totally. People just don't really consider Yugoslavia as a central location of the Holocaust. And I wanted to put the historiography of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia in dialogue with the historiography of the Holocaust elsewhere. But I also wanted to, in doing so, present its unique and different features, and to in some ways also then make a broader point about particularities of Holocaust, actual Holocaust in places, and then particularities of the Holocaust memory in places. So very briefly, you're absolutely right. Obviously, the memory of the Holocaust was a little bit different in the Yugoslav spaces during communism than in the Soviet Union and Soviet-controlled areas, because Yugoslavia was more liberal, partly, but also because, I mean, there was very little institutional anti-Semitism among Yugoslav communist leadership, which was not the case in the Soviet Union, or Poland, or Hungary. That there's a larger story about the relative lack of institutional anti-Semitism, and there are many reasons for it. But there was the Yugoslav Jewish communists were more integrated into the leadership in general, and they were given very prominent positions, and they were also given the portfolio of some kind of Holocaust memory. So some of the leading, Moshe Piade, for example, was a leading advisor to Tito, who was given free rein to, coordinate some kind of Holocaust memory. So Yugoslavia was the location of some of Europe's earliest memorials to Jewish Holocaust victims. I was trying to think if I have in this presentation, but I don't. I can look it up on the internet and show you some of the early 1952 monuments. So in 1952, the Yugoslav Jewish Federation, with not financing, but with support of the Yugoslav state, was allowed to erect specific memorials to Jewish victims of the Holocaust, including in Hebrew language, in Belgrade, Sarajevo, Zagreb, Karlovac, Đakovo, maybe a couple of other cities. And these were official events in 1952. The biggest one was this memorial by the same architect who did the Jasenovac flower, Bogdan Bogdanovic, is an important Yugoslav architect. And so he built a really beautiful large monument, a kind of deconstructed menorah, that's what it looks like, in the Belgrade Sephardic cemetery that sits across from the Belgrade Ashkenazi, the two cemeteries. So this is in the Sephardic cemetery, and he built it from the rubble of Old Town Belgrade, that was where most of the Jews lived. So you can still see in the memorial parts of, like, you know, Hebrew lettering from like shops and things like that. So this was already in 1952. The only older European memorial specifically to Jewish victims of the Holocaust, so not to World War II, but what we would today consider as a specific Jewish victim memorial, was in Paris. So this was all very early, and it was with support. Now, the problem was that the Yugoslav Jewish community already was very small. It was decimated during the war, and then those who survived, most of them left for Israel. So that there's a tiny, one of the people I interviewed, who was director of the Jewish community, called it, you know, remains of the remains. That's how he said. And so there was a very little interest or public understanding of this. As years progressed, the memory became slightly less particular to Jewish suffering, and there was more of a opposition to it, especially in the 1980s, as different nationalisms started to press against the Yugoslav state. So Serbian nationalism, Croatian nationalism. I have a section about this in the book. The Jewish community wanted to memorialize the Holocaust in the 80s by issuing a postal stamp, and it was rejected by the Postal Federation that said everybody suffered equally in World War II. So we do not appreciate particular nationalisms, as if, you know, the Holocaust Memorial is like, you know, it's Jewish nationalism. So that became, you know, much more problematic as the war. But certainly there was more of an there was more space for Jewish remembrance during Tito's Yugoslavia. However, Tito, for example, never once visited Jasenovac. He's never once visited Croatian concentration camps, because that was a more complicated picture. Now there are Croatians who are now our brothers in unity who have committed, you know, anti-Semitic genocide. And so it was easier to commemorate German crimes than Croatian crimes. So that's, you know, still, even having said that, most of the sites of actual killing were abandoned, discarded, not really memorialized, but there was more space. On the second question, which was the diaspora question, diaspora was hugely important. It's important for the story I just told about Croatia. This whole Bleiburg fantasy about, you know, Croatian Holocaust, this was all started in the Croatian diaspora, not just in the United States, but a lot of it in Australia. Huge Croatian community that was then sending money and not just financially supporting, like the museum that you said in Latvia, but also creating this national narrative that is then become, like in Croatian constitution allows diaspora to vote. And so that's partly why this right-wing party kept winning all elections, because, you know, Croatians all over the world can vote, and they have a tendency to be right-wing. A lot of them are emigres. A lot of them aligned with the Ustasha, or at least anti-communist. Latin America, huge Croatian immigration as well. This is the case all over Eastern Europe. I talk a lot about this in the book. In Lithuania, there's a particular narrative that kind of explains this museum that's called double genocide. They use this a lot. And it's double genocide is Holocaust and communism, and it's all one big thing. And that coin, the term, was the term was coined in the Lithuanian diaspora. I think they had like a big meeting in Chicago, I believe, where they started to talk about how they can present this to the Europeans and explain finally that, you know, the real crime were the Soviet deportations, and that's the suffering. You know, this Jewish thing is a sad thing that happened, but it's for Jews to mourn. It's not really, you know, part of a Lithuanian master narrative, which is problematic. And then your last question is the crux of the, and even like, as I was presenting this today, I haven't given this talk in a couple of months, and it seems so out of date, you know, now thinking about, you know, the words I'm saying and thinking about like how this is actually weaponized in the current occupation of Ukraine. I talk a little bit about this in the book. I have in the conclusion kind of little vignettes about how I think my argument may travel in other countries. So I talk about Slovakia, and I talk about Ukraine, and I talk about Russia without even anticipating any of this. And so for that, I did some research on both some of the problematic aspects of Ukrainian Holocaust memory. I mean, the crux of the matter is that, yes, there were right-wing militias, especially the UPA and OUN, that were allied with the Nazis, that did participate in the Holocaust. At some point, then, they turned against the Nazis. Stepan Bandera is this big figure in this movement, and he was then imprisoned by the Nazis, but then he was released. So it's a complicated. There seem to have been opportunists more than anybody else, but certainly they are guilty of anti-Semitic attacks. So that is all true, and it's a problematic part of how Ukraine wants to remember itself and its national heroes in World War II. And I don't think that there's any doubt that there was a lack of clear kind of exposure to you know, how damaging these movements were. All of that is true. However, then Putin comes and says, you are all Nazis. so you know, the way in which Russian memory politics plays into this is also a little bit different, because it doesn't fit the story that I told here, because Russia has never left that anti-fascist World War II patriotic war memory. They've never moved to this, like, you know, post-communist understanding of it. We're still stuck in 1950, basically. And Russia has, a couple of years ago, passed this memory law that makes it a criminal offense. 2 days before the invasion, they actually introduced specific penalties to the law about how we can remember World War II, and you can be penalized by saying anything other than that, you know, the glorious patriotic war and blah, 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 blah. And so this is clearly something that's been used by Russia to portray all of these other governments as contemporary fascists, not fascists back in 1939, but they're today the same as they were, you know, 80 years ago, and has used this constantly for domestic purposes and for international purposes, to some success, to portray the Baltic states and Ukraine as these dangerous Nazis that are, you know, coming back. And just finally, since I've been talking a lot, it's also used by a lot of these right-wing groups and right-wing intellectuals to deflect any questions about why they don't deal more seriously with complicity in the Holocaust by saying, you sound like Putin. People told me this a million times. I would go to Lithuania and I would, you know, say, well, maybe you shouldn't talk about double genocide. Maybe you shouldn't really say that Soviet deportations were the same as extermination. And they said, that's what Putin says. I'm like, but I don't care. But I mean, who cares what Putin says? Like, you can't have a museum. This museum was one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen. The Vilnius Museum, they've changed its name in 2018. So it's no longer called Museum of Victims of Genocide. It's called Museum of Victims of the Occupations, is important here. But it's extremely upsetting. It's housed in a former KGB building. What they don't tell you that it was also a Gestapo building, but that's not. It's all KGB all the time. It's a KGB building. So they preserved all these like various torture rooms, and they have the most graphic images of Lithuanian anti-Soviet partisans who were captured by the Soviet troops and then like slaughtered. And then initially they had nothing about a Holocaust, zero. And then foreigners complained, various EU officials claimed, the Israeli ambassador complained, so they made a room. So it's a room, has like a yellow Star of David in it, so that you know that's a Holocaust room. You go there if you're interested. One room in the museum, so you're going there. And it's all very technical information about how contemporary Lithuanian scientists are proving with DNA where bodies are buried. But there's no history of the Holocaust Lithuania. There's no story of Lithuanian complicity and direct. And most Jews in Lithuania were actually shot by Lithuanians. None of that.
Partisans that are commemorated in the other part of the museum are the people who are complicit in the.
Of course they are.
The Jews.
Yes.